Yeah. Is that better? Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and start here momentarily. It's good to see you all. Hope you had a good day today. A few minutes late. Visitors, glad that you're here with us. Good to see Ben again. Good to see you. Your monthly visit to Wichita. That's right. Cool. We're happy to have you again. We'll go ahead and we'll be in Ecclesiastes Chapter 5 tonight. And we'll go ahead and we'll start with a prayer. So let's bow. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day and just for this opportunity you've given us to assemble here and to study your word, and pray that it's pleasing to you, God, and that we get from it what you want us to get. And we're so thankful for all the people that are here tonight that were willing to kind of set aside whatever else was on their schedule, that were willing to drive out here in the dark and to study your word, and we're all encouraged by each other, God. And so we thank you for this, and it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and maybe I have set it up so that these sections, I'm presenting them maybe a little bit more rigid than maybe the author's intending, but to me there is some sort of a flow of thought is my point. And at the same time, it is kind of wisdom literature, so sometimes we struggle to see how everything connects. But I kind of see chapters, basically chapter 3 through the end of chapter 5 as kind of one section where things are at least somewhat connected here. And it's in that section at the beginning of chapter 3 where you get that poem where there's a time for everything, right? There's if you look at the beginning of chapter 3, a time to give birth and a time to die. And it kind of goes from there. And everything else kind of fits in between that, doesn't it? That everything that takes place in our life, surprise, takes place between birth and takes place between death. And he kind of goes on and describes the human experience. But what's surprising about that is that he ends up saying in verse 11 that he has made everything beautiful in its time, or everything appropriate in its time. And so the idea there, to me at least, is that God is kind of behind the scenes in these things that we find ourselves, these situations we find ourselves in. I think the idea is that God has a purpose for them, that there is something that we can get out of them, there is a reason for them, if we're just willing to kind of trust God. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we'll always see the reason. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a reason nonetheless. And so that's kind of the springboard for this section, and kind of having that in the back of our minds. And so we'll get to chapter 5 here. Let's go ahead and just read. Somebody want to read verses 1 through 7 for me? Verses 1 through 7. Yeah, go ahead.
Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools. For they do not know what they are doing. They do not know that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay payment, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should vow than you should vow and not pay. It should be better that you should not vow than you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the works of your hands? For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. But God is the one you must fear.
All right. I appreciate how you stumbled over the part that said, let not your mouth lead you into sin. That was good. So when we get into this, we looked at last week in particular, mainly chapter 4, but we've kind of been looking at this, that he says that everything is like appropriate, everything's beautiful in its time, and it's one thing to kind of say that, it's another thing to kind of look at the world around us and come to a place where we're really trusting God in that. And so I kind of see as you go through and you round out chapter 4 and chapter 3, that he's kind of looking at things, and these are the types of things, a lot of them are things that people would bring up as objections for God, and his existence is what we would be objecting to today, or some would object to today. But back then it might have been his character. You know, why should I worship the God of Israel? Or they look at life, and it just doesn't seem to jive with their belief that there is a God that is in control, that has a reason for the various circumstance that we find ourselves in. And so the types of things he brings up are unjust courts and the idea of death. You know, how do you deal with that one? How do you say everything's beautiful in its time when it all just leads to death? Or at least that's what it seems like if you don't have God. What about oppression and the fact that there's all these people that are being oppressed, and a lot of them are being oppressed through these political powers, through people that have authority in the world, and there's nobody there to stop them. There's nobody there to give these people who are oppressed comfort. What about when we do good things, but it just kind of results in people envying us, or our motivation for doing good things is often born out of envy, is something that he kind of talks about. And then if you're fortunate enough to accumulate wealth and riches and have a high social status in this world, what we so often find is that people with wealth, they end up being lonely, that they're not happy, and that somehow their possessions and their achievements actually serve to alienate them and make them miserable. And then even if you have popularity, even if you have people that are following you, he describes a king and how that king, you know, the time is ticking. That the king who's popular today, there's going to come a time where nobody's listening to him, nobody's paying attention to him because they're paying attention to another guy. And we see that all the time in the political world. So it's kind of like, even if you reach the pinnacle, what's the point of this? It all seems so temporary, and it all seems to run out. And so before we move on and deal with chapter 5, what we just read, I kind of want to ask the question, when it comes to questioning God and kind of looking at the various problems in the world, I want to start off by asking this: what's the potential danger when it comes to us questioning God and kind of how he works and how the world works in light of him being in control? Is there any potential danger in that? Yes or no? Yeah, it can. Yeah. And I'll be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong per se with asking questions. I think a lot of people have maybe been hurt by people who are members of God's church because they had real, genuine questions and they were kind of dismissed out of hand. That's not really what I'm asking here. I guess what I'm thinking of is that we can go about asking these questions in a way that's really irreverent. And in my life, in my short ministry here, since I've been doing this about 4 years, I've seen that there are two kinds of people that tend to ask questions. There are people that are really struggling with their faith, that have genuine questions, they're coming across things, and they're struggling to reconcile them. Maybe it's something that's going on in their life, and they're trying to work through it in their relationship with God. But then there are people that always assume the worst in God when they're asking these questions. At the moment a bad circumstance happens to them, they're assuming that God is out to get them. And what I found is that a lot of times I have very little success in teaching those people that are constantly looking at God as out to get them, that there's no good explanation for why this could be, so on and so forth. And so I think that when we get to chapter 5, the reason I bring this up is because the first thing he says is guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few, for a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. And so I think that his first answer to all these kinds of objections and his answer to the guy that's recognizing all the problems in this earth is, first of all, approach God. Go to God. Go to the house of God. But what should we do when we go to the house of God? What does he say? Listen, right? First of all, he says, guard your steps, right? What do you suppose he means by that? Guard your steps. In verse 1. Do you go to the house? I think it's the same thing. I think he's saying go to God, go to the house of God. I think he means the same thing. Yeah. But why does he say guard your steps? What does he mean by that? Go ahead, Amy. Yeah, so we're going to God realizing that he's God and I'm not, right? And we got to be really careful when we say, I don't understand this is stupid. If there is a God, it's stupid that he works this way. We got to be really careful with our attitude when we go to God, because if I'm saying those things and God is real, I'm going to come off looking really foolish in the eyes of God, aren't I? And so he says it's better to draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools. And so what's the sacrifice of fools? What does that even mean? What is a fool's sacrifice, you suppose?
Probably one of the things is to worship God without authority.
Okay.
That's kind of a bad thing to say these days, but it's true.
Yeah.
Just to worship him any way you feel like worshiping is at least an aspect of it.
Yeah, totally. Yep. So does anybody else's version say something differently in verse 1? Mine uses the word listen. What does your version say in verse 1 rather than listen?
The King James says draw near to hear.
Draw near to hear. Okay. Anybody else? Obedience. That's right. So it's interesting because that Hebrew word, it means both. I mean, if you take it literally, it means listen. But if you're really listening, what do? Right? You do this all the time for those of you who still have kids in the home, for those of you who used to have kids in the home or now have grandkids in the home. What do you mean when you tell them they're getting into trouble or you want them to follow some sort of rule that you're giving them? What do you say before you give it to them? You say, listen, right? And what do you mean by that? When you say listen up, what do you mean? You mean just, hey, let this go in one ear and out the other. I just want to make sure that this just goes into your ears. Is that what you mean by that?
Take it to heart.
Take it to heart, okay? And how would you know that your child has taken what you said to heart?
I do it when you say that you want them to do.
All right. That's what this word means. It doesn't mean that I'm drawing near and I'm just listening to, maybe a Sunday morning sermon, right? And I've checked the list. No, when I'm listening to God, whether it's through Scripture, whether it's through somebody else's teaching, it's more than just, okay, I'm getting these words into my ears, but these words are being internalized, and I'm actually doing them. And so with that in mind, again, what do you think this idea of the sacrifice of fools is? With listening being this idea of obeying. What's the sacrifice of a fool? Not doing what he says, right? But do you offer your sacrifice? Is there a sacrifice being offered there? Yeah. 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 Yeah, I wasn't planning on...
You're sacrificing what you think needs to be sacrificed instead of what you ask.
Yeah, absolutely. All the above. And I wasn't planning on bringing up this passage, but I'm remembering when in Proverbs it's talking about the adulterous woman and avoiding her. What's one of the things that she said she's done so that they can go and do whatever it is that they're going to do together? Doesn't she say, I've already offered... Yeah, made vows, I've offered my sacrifices, right? And so, that's the sacrifice of fools, right? That, I've asked for forgiveness ahead of time. I've done what I need to do, and now I can do whatever I want until the time comes for me to sacrifice again. And that's a total abuse of the system. That's really mocking God is what it amounts to. And so there's a famous passage in 1 Samuel 15, verse 22. Can somebody read that for me? And to set it up, we're all pretty familiar with this, I think. That's when Saul, he's told to go in and to slaughter the Amalekites. And what was he specifically told? when he went in and did that? You guys remember? Okay, that's right. Well, you spoiled it. That's okay. That's exactly what Samuel says, but what was it that Saul was told before he went in? What was it? That's right, slaughter everything. All their possessions, take nothing back, take nobody back with you. And Saul says, all right, and what is it that Saul ends up doing? What did he end up doing? Yeah, that's right. Spare the king, spare the animals, and the excuse he gave for doing it was what? To sacrifice. I'm sacrificing to God. Isn't that great that Saul did this? What a great idea from a human perspective. And that's when Samuel says what to him? What's better? It's better to obey than to sacrifice. And so I think this is kind of the idea behind this, or that's an example of what a fool's sacrifice is, to kind of check the boxes of piety. I said my prayers, I was baptized, I go to church, and then now that's license for me to go and do whatever I want. No, we got to be listening with a heart to obey what God has told us to do, and to do otherwise is to mock God and to kind of offer the sacrifice of fools. Yeah, go ahead. Pin it back.
There's a verse in
Yep.
Romans 1, you just kind of are just hammering this point, which is really, really good, I think. And it says, it's Paul's, as an apostle, what his job is, at least as a major focus. And
Yeah.
what it says, here's what you're saying exactly. It says, to bring about the obedience of faith. That's the beginning of Romans,
Yeah.
and it's the end of Romans. And that's what it's all about. It's exactly what you're saying. It's
Yeah.
all about that verse, the obedience of faith.
Yeah.
Faith cometh by what? Hearing, and hearing by the word.
Yeah.
Do what you're told.
It's interesting that we sometimes forget that those two ideas aren't exclusive from each other. Faith and obedience, right? Yeah, good point. Ben, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
I want to ask a question, and if we think this is too far out of the line here.
I just won't have the answer for it, but go ahead. Yeah.
What is your understanding of a woke culture? How do you define woke?
Woke?
I
Oh,
can see related to what we're talking about with what I've heard.
yeah. You're going to get me in trouble here, Ben. But what do you think? Let me ask that.
Why? Well, maybe I don't want to say.
No, go ahead. I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Yeah.
I really didn't know, and don't know that I still do. That's why I raised the question.
Yeah.
And this Christian culture, because I was at Sam's Club, eating a pizza, and a family came in that didn't have any place to sit, so I asked them to sit down, and we got to talking about the woke
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah.
And I asked the young man who's in his late teens, and his response was, people doing what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, their definition of whatever is right with them will do it.
Yeah.
That's why I asked the question, is everybody?
Well, I'll say this, and I don't know that it's just limited to the woke culture, but I think there's a lot of preaching our message, right? Putting it on Facebook, showing that I have the values that, I want people to know that I have. But then, okay, what am I actually doing when it comes to my everyday life? In other words, there's a lot of virtue signaling, I think, going on. And maybe that's a little bit of what you're getting at. That
Well, I'm just thinking about, going into the house of God,
yeah,
and, well, it's happening in the church today, with people doing,
and accepting things that aren't biblical, too, I think is probably what you're getting at. Yeah.
some churches right now,
Yeah.
where they have added women elders. I'm talking about Church
Yeah.
of Christ. I think they need to put a parenthetical thing at the bottom.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and homosexuality and all that stuff is becoming more and more accepted, and I think it comes from a place of, I believe it comes from a place of compassion, but we got to have obedience, right? And I think it's kind of compassion that errs into disobedience. Go ahead, Amy.
Well, to me, this is why that guard your steps is
Yeah.
so important, because the thing is, right, it actually says they do this out of ignorance. So that's a little bit scary. We should all be a little bit frightened by that, because we are not paying attention, because we're not being thoughtful in what we do and making sure that we go to God for the authority, then we may very well fall
Yeah. Well, again, I think Saul genuinely had some good intentions there, but the problem was that's not what God asked for. And I think you're right. We got to be really careful of that. I've heard phrases like, so-and-so has a good sense of the scriptures. I don't know what that means. I think sometimes we get this idea that I just kind of have a sense of, I've studied this book long enough, I just kind of got a sense of what God wants. It's like, no, we always got to be careful that we're a people of the book and going back to his word and not just saying, okay, I've been doing this long enough, now I kind of got it down and I can kind of assume I kind of got God figured out. We got to be careful with that. I think all those were great points, though, that when we approach God, we're guarding our steps, we're very careful, we're recognizing that this is God's house, right? I mean, in this context, that we're approaching God. That's a serious thing. And just a second, I kind of meant to put the conclusion of this section and state that. In verse 7, this little passage of verses that we read, the last thing he says is, therefore, fear God. And you kind of see that in everything that he says in these passages, that when we approach God, we recognize I'm approaching a holy God. And I think in those days when you're in the temple, they kind of had some aesthetic things going for themselves. And they could see, wow, this is a house of a holy God. I better approach him carefully. But we got to have the same mindset, whether it's in prayer, whether it's when I show up for worship, whether it's with my brothers. Just every day, our life is a living sacrifice. I got to make sure that the worship I'm offering is in the fear of God, not just being presumptuous. Go ahead, John, you had your hand up. Yeah.
Worship in spirit and truth. It seems like all we've been talking about, we get people that are really focused on the ritual, their heart's not in it at all. They're lopsided one way, and you get the other people that are, all feelings about, the both topic of social, things that are legit.
Yeah.
Social injustice, they have a noble seed there.
Mm-hmm.
It gets twisted into its own idol.
Yeah.
Without the need for the truth.
Right.
So, a lot of self-reflection there as well. I've had moments in my life where I'm hyper-focused on the truth. I'm probably more in that ritualistic angle, and then there are other times where maybe I wasn't, basically, just out of balance.
Yeah.
So, making sure we're evaluating, are we a true worshiper or not?
Yeah. We're always going to one extreme or the other. And I don't remember the exact quote, but I read somebody once that said, like half of false doctrine is born out of a poor response to false doctrine, right? So we hear a doctrine we don't like, and then our response is to react in such an extreme way that I've now created a false doctrine. And one example is, I think when this quote was given that I read it, was on the issue of baptism. And I've probably mentioned this before, I think I have recently. But you look at church history, and it was unanimous. Everybody believed, that's the moment that you're saved. That's what baptism is for. Well, guess what happened? It developed to this point where what did people start to believe about the water itself? Yeah, the water, there's something magical, mystical about the water. And is that the case? No, it's God that's doing the miraculous. And so what happened was people kind of reacted. They went the other extreme and said, well, no, it's not baptism. We don't need baptism at all. You just need God. And so my point is, that's just one example, right? And you guys are bringing up kind of modern issues as well. But our tendency is to go from one extreme to another. And a lot of times, the truth is somewhere in between. Not always, but a lot of times. I've certainly found that to be the case, at least. Appreciate that. We'll keep going here. Thanks for your participation. So just kind of looking at this, we're to fear God, and not just in the sense that we're to obey, but we're to fear God when we speak. And so the next thing he says is, be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven, and you are on earth. And so what are some examples of being hasty with our words before God? I guess one thing that's interesting, though, is that he says, let not your heart be hasty. So this is something that starts in your heart. But the end result is that you utter something before God, I think that, we wish we could have back, or that we shouldn't say before God. But what's an example of that, you think?
In Job, Job actually makes the statement. I think it's in the 5th chapter, maybe the 6th chapter. He says, I was rash with my mouth. And yet, when you see Job
Yeah.
It's a pretty good question, but Job, he questioned God, and it almost, when you read it, you go, man, he's out of line. He acknowledged he was rash
Yeah.
with some of the speech he did. But I don't know if he's an example or not, because of what's said at the end.
Yeah,
He was
yeah,
wrong.
yeah. And I think that maybe you can be rash sometimes, and it's not necessarily like you're sinful. I mean, you look at Job and his situation; it was so unique. He's going through something difficult, and I do think Job's kind of dancing towards that line sometimes. But the guy lost his children; he lost everything. His wife says, "Curse God and die." I think what I love about the book of Job is I think God kind of looks at us, and sometimes I think it's showing us God has a lot of mercy towards us when we're working through these things. I think you're right, because Job also is kind of a good example. We got to be really careful. Does anybody else want to say anything before we look at another passage here? Go ahead.
It seems
Yeah.
like that this has more to do with them elevating themselves and being hasty in what they're saying. So the friends would have been more
Yeah, yeah,
their thinking,
Right.
because they were assuming that they knew what God was doing.
yeah, yeah.
So they were being rash with them
Right, right.
because they elevated themselves up.
Yeah, good point. Amy, go ahead.
Well, this reminds me a little bit of the prayer, the parable that Jesus told where the Pharisee went in and he's lifting his hands up, he's making a grandiose speech of God, I'm so grateful, I'm not
Yeah.
these other people. And then the tax collector says very few words, simple words, but just says, I'm a sinner.
Yeah,
And I think that's the difference is it feels, don't be rash, don't be hasty to go in and, Lord, aren't you lucky to have me?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Where, we need to be thoughtful about this. We are approaching, once again, the creator of the universe.
Yeah.
And I think it's very easy for man to become very proud of what we do. Even self-righteous.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great example, one that I hadn't thought of, but you're right. And especially you look at the length of prayers compared, looking at the Pharisee, how long his prayer is, and he just can go on and on about himself. And probably because he's got a lot of pride. The other guy, he realizes he's a sinner. He's got a lot less to say about himself, doesn't he? I'm a sinner, and that's all there is to it. So it's interesting that you mentioned Job, because to me, when I see this statement about God is in heaven, you're on earth, that's like exactly what God says to Job. And so I was kind of thinking the same thing. And Job is interesting because he doesn't sin, right? But I do think he kind of dances towards that line, and I think that's he's getting really close to that line. And that's when God says, "All right, Job, let's do this. You want to have this kind of debate? Let's go this back and forth. Where were you when I did on and on and on he goes." We remember reading this. But at the end of that, I love Job's response. "I know that you can do anything, and no plan of yours can be thwarted. You asked, 'Who is this who conceals my counsel with ignorance?' Surely I spoke about things I did not understand, things too wondrous for me to know." And so I think the problem sometimes when we're in these various circumstances of life is we got to be careful and understand that a lot of times we might be speaking about things that we just don't understand, but God does. And so I put the question up here as well. Is there a right and a wrong way to ask questions before God? Would be an example of, the wrong way of going about doing it. Maybe we've kind of touched on that a little bit, but what do you think?
Why did you make me like this?
Yeah.
It's one of the ones way we go to God. Why did you make me like this?
Yeah, like God didn't know what he was doing when he made you, right? And sometimes it's not that God made me this way, it's that I've kind of made myself this way too. Sometimes what the case is as well. Go ahead, Amy.
Well, I have a question, actually.
Yeah.
We talked about this a little bit on Sunday night in the ladies' class, but, when you compare Zachariah and Mary, when they were both approached and given a promise, Zachariah and Mary actually had very similar questions. How is this going to happen?
Yeah.
But Zachariah is confused, and
Yeah.
Mary is not.
Yeah.
And so I do actually wonder if maturity plays a part into this, and even how, should Zachariah have known better?
Yeah.
Should he he was a priest, he was older, right? I mean, all of those things. I don't know. I actually even start to wonder if some of those play into how we approach God too.
Yeah.
That God understands, you may not have the right understanding, and that's why we're asking this question.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, the Zechariah one's interesting. I mean, I don't have a good answer for it, but I do think a lot of times you say maturity, sometimes it has to do with what's in our heart. Why am I asking? Or why am I doubting? And that's where I said before, I've had studies with guys where they're almost looking for problems in the text. They're looking for inconsistencies in God's character, and the moment they think they find one, they're assuming the worst. And I just think that we're being warned about that. That there's a way to ask God questions, where we're wrestling with God and it's genuine, and maybe we're struggling in our faith. But then I think there's also a time where it kind of is almost irreverent the way we go about doing it, I guess. And a lot of it has to do, again, with, I think, motivations that are in our heart for why we're asking. Anybody else? I guess as well what I was thinking as far as rash words is I also met with somebody before who, they had doubted God because of their circumstances of life. And then they made a big mistake in their life, and they were asking God, and actually, to their credit, their faith was turning back to God, but the type of question they were asking was like, okay, why did God allow me to end up, in this bad situation that they got themselves into? Is God punishing me? And I think that's making assumptions of what God's doing in our life, that we make an assumption sometimes that God's punishing me, when sometimes I'm in this position, not necessarily because God's punishing me, but just because this is the natural consequences of the decisions that I make. I think sometimes the punishment is God giving us up to what we want to do and our choices, and that's kind of the Romans 1 idea. And so I think we just got to be careful sometimes in making assumptions of what God is doing. My mentor used to say that God gets credit for a lot of things. He said that kind of sarcastically, like, sometimes we give him credit for things that aren't necessarily things that he should get credit for in the terms of blame and those types of situations. And so lastly, in this little section, fear God when making vows. It's interesting that he mentions this. He says, when you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It's better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? And then verse 7, when dreams increase and words grow, there's vanity, but God is the one you must fear. And so it's curious to me that he mentions vows, but I think the idea is just be careful with our words, because if we're going to God and just heaving up a bunch of words, that's a way to get ourselves in trouble. And sometimes when things aren't going our way and there's something that we really want, what is it that we do in our prayers to God to get that thing? Yes, right. Let's make a deal, right? So what do you mean by that, wheel and deal? Yeah. So if you give...
If you will do this for me, I'll give this to you.
That's right. And I don't necessarily think that that's like inherently wrong. You have vows in the Bible where I think a lot of times the idea was, God, I'm promising to do this if you do this for me. But where's the problem come in? What is it that Solomon is speaking to? Is he condemning vows themselves? Rash vows. So what would be an example of a rash vow? What? Oh, yeah, right, exactly. Where he was already guaranteed victory, right? What's another example? How about just like in everyday life? I guess John kind of hit on it already. Like, we want something, and I say, God, if you give this to me, I'll do it. And it's one thing to do, to say that, but what should I be very intentional about doing once I've said that? I better follow through with it, because if I didn't take that vow seriously, does that mean that God didn't take it seriously either? No. And he says, it's interesting, verse 6, let not your mouth lead you into sin. In other words, if you can't do it, don't promise it. And he says, don't say before the messenger that it was a mistake. And that word messenger, there's some people that think you would go to the temple, you would make a vow, and then you would do it in front of somebody, there would be a witness, and they would have people that would follow up to make sure that you've delivered on that vow. That's one example that I heard. But that word messenger also, we know it can be translated as angel. It's the same word. Just kind of curious, but you have a guy who's made a vow, he's not able to follow through, and when he realizes he hasn't followed through, what does he say? What's his excuse? Whoops, it was a mistake. And, God takes vows very seriously. And so there's even sacrifices involved, that you would make a sacrifice if you made a rash vow that you couldn't follow through on. And so, again, just because I didn't take it seriously, just because I forgot about what I vowed, doesn't mean that God has. And so we're really, really careful with our words before God, that we're very careful with the words that we choose, whether I'm praying, whether I'm telling God, hey, this is something that I'm going to do, or this is something that I'm never going to do again, God. Well, I better be careful when I say that. And if we can't deliver on it, then don't say it. And so let's move on here to the next section in verse 8. After he tells us to fear God, he kind of comes back to some of these objections that were raised. He doesn't really deal with all of them, though. And I think that's because God doesn't necessarily owe us an explanation for every question that we might have. At some point, faith has to come into it. But in verse 8, he comes back to some things. And some of you just mind reading verses 8 through 9 for me.
You see oppression of the poor, denial of justice, righteousness, and promise. Do not be shocked at the sight, for one official watches over another official, and there are higher officials over them. After all, he who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land.
All right, so I'll just preface this by saying verse 9 is, a lot of people struggle with interpreting that one, translating that one, but I'll give you my take on it in a moment here. But I want to remind you, in chapter 4, he talks about oppression, he talks about injustice, and at the end he says, it's better basically for somebody to not have lived at all than even to have lived and died. Again, he's looking at this from under the sun only perspective. But in verse 22 of, I guess it was chapter 3 actually, not chapter 4, he says, I've seen there's nothing better. Excuse me, that's not it. I was trying to find it here. Verse 3 of chapter 4. Better than either of them is the one who has not yet existed, who has not seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. And I guess what stands out to me about that is that he's not just saying this in light of experiencing oppression. He's saying this in light of witnessing oppression. And we talked a little bit about how when we're just constantly on our phones, taking in the news, which is always bad news, it weighs on us, doesn't it? And we're not even the ones experiencing it, but just to kind of witness it on our televisions or on our phone screens, it weighs on us. And he kind of acknowledges that, I think, in chapter 4. And so he comes back to that in verses 8 through 9 of chapter 5. He says, if you see in the province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, he says, do not be amazed at the matter. In other words, don't just be shocked by this. How can this be? And this is what he goes on to say, the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. And so that's literally what that word means. It's this idea that you have an official, and he's in charge, but then who's above him watching over him? Another official. And who's above that guy, right? Isn't that how life works? There's always a bigger fish. And so what's his point in saying that, do you think? Why is he reminding his readers, hey, there's oppression, don't be amazed. And the reason he gives it is, look, there's guys that are kind of watching over these guys that are above you. There's somebody above him. What's the reminder, you think? There's probably two ways to look at this verse. I'll say that. So,
I see there's a lot of opportunities for oppression.
okay.
That's where we're doing somebody, it's an opportunity for oppression. And there's a lot of layers of that opportunity.
Yeah. And in fact, my CSB I think it's a little bit of a liberty. I'm not sure if I subscribe to this meaning, but it's kind of along those same lines that you're bringing out, Andy. Mine says one official protects another official, a higher official protects them. So they take watching as, protecting, guarding these guys, which, hey, I'll take both translations of this. That is true, right? You can have oppression and corruption going on, and a lot of times it continues to go on because the whole thing is corrupt. Everybody's corrupt up the ladder. What's another way of looking at this, you think?
If everybody's corrupt here, like you're saying, I think that it is, and you're seeing this. He makes that point in verse 8, and then in verse 9, you're not there yet, but anyway, it says, after all. In other words, what is the point that he's making in verse 8 when he says after all what? Well, you see all this people running stuff, and they're just crazy people in the government, which is really, nobody probably understands that. Anyway, the government is pretty wide, right? And they're all going to be held accountable. But then he says, after all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. Well, he's not talking about the church.
Right.
He's talking about the people.
Yeah.
And a working government, that even if it's corrupt, is better than none.
Right.
That's kind of what I see as one point.
Yes.
Just one paper.
Yeah. And I think, again, because there's so many translation issues, that is one way to see this, that a lot of commentators will say, well, it's better to have a king than to have no king at all. And that's true, isn't it? Even if you take the fields thing literally, if it's just, hey, let's just govern ourselves, how long is that going to work out for all those farmers, right? It's not. Go ahead.
And also, like, everything's relative, like,
Yeah.
the poor are gonna be oppressed, but so are all these people that have other people above them.
Yeah.
So nobody's really gonna be excused from having to suffer the consequence of working there.
And that's kind of how I see it, is that everybody's being held accountable. And to me, another way of looking at verse 9, in fact, I think my version puts it this way: the profit from the land is taken by all, the king is served by all. And so I think another way of looking at this is that everybody's going to be held accountable, I think ultimately, when Judgment Day comes. But then you also look at it, and doesn't the king depend on the people too? And I'm reminded of 1 Kings 12 when Rehoboam, he's taken the different advice. So, should I oppress people even more than my dad did, where the people of Israel were, kind of looks like Solomon enslaved his own people. And Rehoboam saying, should I go easy on them? And the wise guys say, the old wise men say, go easy on them, lessen the burden. And then Rehoboam, he goes and takes the other advice, which was, just go harder on them. And what ends up happening as a result? Yeah, the kingdom, it blows up, right? And so I think that when you look at injustice and oppression, it can only get so bad until people finally get tired of it. And I think that we've seen that throughout history. But I think either way, there's accountability, and we know that God ultimately will hold any people committing injustices accountable for sure. We're almost out of time, but I probably should just wrap up right there. Anybody else have any comments or questions as we wrap up? Man, I was doing so good getting one chapter done every week, and just got derailed tonight, but that's all right. No, it was good. I enjoyed the discussion, and that's more valuable to me. I really enjoyed and appreciated your input, so thank you for doing that. Do it again next week. But yeah, no other comments. We'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you.